All right, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first Siggraph. I've been wanting to come for years, and so it's awesome to get to come in to give a talk. So the title of this talk is Transforming Version Control for Film and Television. And I want to give you a little bit of insight into what that means. Basically, version control has meant something to the games industry and software development for a long time. And it's meant something kind of different in film and television. But now, because of the rise of virtual production and using game engines in visual effects, whether that's on set or in post-production, suddenly the world of film and post-production is being introduced to a different way of thinking about version control. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, talk about some of those ideas, cover maybe a few stories, talk about some interesting use cases, but kind of the point of this is I want to get you thinking a little bit differently about what's possible and how we can be using this as a tool to improve our pipelines rather than thinking of it as something that's going to come along and solve our problem for us. So if you're someone who's worked in pipeline development, or you've ever worked on coordinating a pipeline for a studio, and someone comes along and says, hey, check it out. We have this product. Use us and it'll solve all your pipeline problems. We got it taken care of. Don't worry about it. If you're like me, you say, yeah, sure, right. Because we know that every single project is different. Every client wants something totally different. Each studio wants to work in a different way. Sometimes even departments within a studio want to work in completely different ways. And so when someone comes along and instead says, hey, I have a tool that you can use for your custom pipeline and improve it, make it better, now I say, okay, I'm listening. Because I want you to work with me. I don't want you to force me to work with you. Let me give you a quick little background about myself. I've been in the film industry for the last 10 years or so. I was a visual effects artist, and then a supervisor, and a lead, and then got into pipeline development and ended up as the person in charge of all of our in-house software for our pipeline at Barnstorm VFX, who's got a booth just over there. And then about a year ago, I came over to Perforce to learn about version control and to help them better understand film and television and advertising clients, and to help people in film and television understand how version control works, because we just have a different way of thinking and we have different needs from games, software development, auto manufacturing, things like that. So all right, let me start off with that question of what is version control? So in the film and television world, we think of version control as, I'm going to make a car. Let's say it's this car here. We'll say this is car A. No, that's boring. This is Steve. This is Steve. And this is Steve, and I save that file as Steve V001, right? I've made my version 1. And then I get some notes, I make some changes, I save that as a new file as Steve V002. And then I get some notes on that, I make Steve V003, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we think about version control, we think about keeping track of all these different files. We think about something like ftrack or shotgrid that is keeping track of these progressive versions that are different files. So then I tell the person who's putting this scene together, I say, hey, I have a new version of Steve. It's called Steve V003. Go put that in the scene. And they go in and they find Steve in this scene and they change it out so it's pointing at that new file. Now, in the games industry, this works very differently. Instead, I have this file. It's just called Steve. I make it. I get some notes on it. I make some changes. And then I save it again just as Steve. And I submit it to my version control software. I submit it through Perforce. And then the person putting this scene together, they see, oh, hey, look, there's a new version of Steve. Let me get the latest. OK, now I have that new version. I didn't have to change anything in my project file. But now I have the latest version of Steve in there. And this, for people in film and games, they go, film and television, they kind of, it melts their brain a little bit at first. At least it did for me. Maybe y'all are better at catching this faster than I am. But this was a very different way of thinking about how we manage our versions and how we manage our assets. But as I started thinking about it, I start seeing how powerful this is and how some of the problems that us who develop pipelines have bent over backwards and cobbled together all of these tools and built all of these custom things to try to avoid certain problems and make things easier for our artists, this tool could make that even more reliable and even easier. So an example of this is we recently did a survey of game developers, and one of the top concerns that game developers have is knowing that they have the latest assets of something. And in film and television, I would say this is even worse. I can't tell you how many times I've seen renders go to the farm, they spend hours, spend a bunch of money in the cloud being rendered, and then when a supervisor or a producer looks at it, they say, but I told you to change this thing back here. And so then they go to the person who made that model that's in the background or that texture or that effect, and they say, hey, what the heck? I thought this was supposed to be different. They say, yeah, I did. You can see it. It's right there in F-Track or ShotGrid or wherever we keep track of this. Yeah, I made that change. And then you realize it's the person who put this scene together and actually sent off the render. Oh, they didn't get that. Or maybe they changed this car, but this same model is used over there somewhere, and they didn't change that one. This happens all the time, and this is a huge waste of time, money, not only the artist's time, but also the producer who had to QC something that really wasn't ready for them to look at. This is a major problem that something like version control can help us solve. One other thing that's interesting about this is that by using version control and storing your assets in the cloud rather than relying on a network server where everyone's connecting to the same files, there's three things. Well, there's a lot of things, but I'll say three big ones. The first one is when you're all working on the same files and two people start to try to work on the same file at the same time and they're both making changes to it and saving it, which ideally isn't happening if you're managing your project well, but it does happen sometimes. When that does, you can have all sorts of issues. Programs crashing, we're overwriting each other's saves, we've lost a lot of work. There's a lot of confusion that can happen there. The second one is just thinking about this from a security point of view, that if everything's on that one network server, and we're all in the office, sure, fine. We're all connected to that one local server. But then, what if we have, a pandemic, and everyone's suddenly working from home? How do we deal with that? Well, okay, we remote into our machines at the office. So we're connecting into our machine in the office, we're pixel streaming, we're working on it that way. Great, files are staying there, it's fine. But something that we very quickly ran into is that quality isn't always quite enough for what you need, especially for the producers who are reviewing things and they want to see grain. They want to see all those little details. They want something to play back at 60 frames per second in 4K. And at least my internet is good, but it's not that good. So we run into these problems, and then people start finding ways to get around it. They'll Dropbox files to themselves, or they'll do things that you shouldn't do, and we never did it, but some people do, right? This is not okay. This is not a good practice. But that's something people do. Now, on the other hand, if you had a version control server, so if you're using Perforce and you have your server, you're able to set permissions for individual files, which IP addresses can connect to it, and you could, in certain circumstances, allow a certain person to actually download those original files to their home for review, assuming that they're on a secured laptop that you can remotely wipe and things like that. I do take security very seriously. At Perforce, we have a lot of customers who are Department of Defense contractors, and I always tell them, yeah, the only industry that takes security more seriously than you is film and television. Another thing to think about is archive. So when we're working in film and television, compared to games, we go through a lot more projects more quickly, right? We might be working on 10, 20 shows at a time, all at different stages of development. And when one's done, it's done. It's not like a game where we're going to keep releasing updates and patches. Once a movie's out, it's out. We can't really change it anymore after that. But we need to keep those files around, because what if they make a season 2? What if they make a sequel? What if we're going to do some more ads in this ad campaign and we want to get all our assets back? Well, we have to archive things. And I've talked to people at many different visual effects studios, and often this process is painful. It's asking all of your artists to go through and figure out what their latest versions were and delete all the other ones and delete their cache files and delete all these other things so that we can fit this onto a disk. Maybe we'll write it to tape. Well, okay. No one's really writing to tape anymore that I'm aware of, but we might move this to Glacier on AWS or some other way of storing these files so that we can get them back if we ever need them. And it's this painful, difficult process. Whereas if we were working on a version control server that's hosted in AWS, we could have each of our projects on a separate EBS volume, so a fast SSD volume in the cloud. And then once we finish that project, we can say, hey, AWS, we don't have to say this, we do it in the console, but we say, hey, change this to a spinning disk. It's going to cost me 60% as much to store it. It's still really available, but it's just going to be a little bit slower if I need to get things. So just in case some last minute changes come in. And then let's say a few weeks go by or a few months and we say, you know what, we're ready to archive this. Great. Let's just move it in place over to Glacier or some kind of cold storage or even snapshot it and store that in S3 and put that in Glacier. That we have all of these options of ways that we can do that without having to copy files, move drives around, store them, maintain spinning disks that can degrade over time. Instead, we're able to just say, hey, yeah, archive this. Great, done. All right, so now I want to get to the slightly more technical part of this talk. And that is I want to talk about branching or streams. So in version control, any kind of version control out there, there's this concept of branching. And in Perforce, we refer to this as streams. That's the way that we prefer to do branching. It kind of adds some extra features on that, but I'll use the two terms interchangeably because the concepts here apply to both. Essentially, when you're creating a different stream or a different branch, it's like you're creating a parallel universe. You've got Dr. Strange, and you open a portal, and he takes your files, a copy of them, and he goes through the portal to this other dimension. And then he's got a team that are working over there in this other dimension. Meanwhile, back in our universe, these files haven't changed. Anything that he's doing over there in his parallel universe doesn't affect us at all. But then we say, hey, the stuff you're doing over there is really cool. We want to get that back over here too. We do what's called a merge. And we bring some of those files back. We figure out which of ours we want to keep, which of his we want to keep, whatever it is, and we do that. And it's great, and this is awesome for when you want things to be separate. The problem is, a thing that I've noticed a lot of VFX studios doing and virtual production studios is they see this idea of streams or branches and they go, organization, cool. I'll make a different stream for each of my departments. So can we turn on the slide for this one? Right, so we might make something like this, where we have our main stream. This is the one that's going to be on the LED volume. This is everything's been tested. It's been approved by producers. And then below that, we have this, I've called it dev. You could call it work in progress, whatever it is. This is where our artists are going to work, where things are going to get approved from before they go up to main, which is what's going to be on your stage. And then we say, cool, organization, yeah. I'm going to make some streams here for my different departments. You can see I just have compositing, effects, layout, modeling, rigging. This could be however you organize things. Maybe it's your different studios in different locations. And you think, cool, this is great. The problem is that, like I said, each of these is a parallel dimension. And so we just had a change in modeling. And you can see this arrow now is turned green to say, hey, there's a change here that's ready to be copied up to development. But the modeler made this change, but no one else sees this yet because they're in that parallel universe, right? Our texturers don't see that yet. Our riggers don't see that yet. And so now we bring that up into development, and still those departments don't see that change. And so now we have to have a supervisor come along and say, okay, yeah, those look good enough. I'm going to bring those down into layout, FX, compositing, rigging. Great. Oh, except shoot, over here in compositing, someone made a change there. So we've got to copy that up first before we merge these changes down. And you end up creating a bunch more work for your supervisors or your leads when you thought you were just organizing things nicely. So what I would propose, and this is wild for someone like myself who's a big proponent of streams, I would actually suggest you start with something like this. Super simple, where we just have our one main stream, that's what's going to be on the stage. And then below that, we have our development stream, or our working stream, where we're actually doing our work. So that all of our artists, all of our departments are actually working in that same stream. So that when our texturer makes a change, the modeler is able to see that there was a change, download that right away. So you're removing those barriers between people who want to see changes right away, but we're keeping this barrier here between something we don't want to happen right away, right? We don't want our stage to get every last little change that an artist makes, because then we could be shooting and something's broken or something's not right, right? We want to have that gap there. So I describe this kind of like as an airlock, or maybe a decontamination chamber, you know, that astronauts go through when they come back from outer space, so they don't bring any space plagues back with them. So another example of how you could use streams would be something like this, where we still have all of our artists working in this development stream here in the middle, but then we have child streams of that for our different vendors. The advantage of this is vendor A, they have some files for us that they've put into this stream. Great. We can get those, we can look at them, but we don't want them to go to our artists right away, because maybe they named them differently, maybe there's something strange about them, and we want to have our vendor coordinator make sure those look right first before we bring that into our development stream for our artists. Meanwhile, over here, it works the other way too. Vendor B, we have some files for them. We have some files that we've updated that they haven't gotten yet. But also, we don't want our vendors to see every single little change in every piece of our project that we're working on. We want to have control of that. Same thing with clients. You could replace these down here with your clients. I want to control and decide what's going to go to the place that the client can see, rather than just giving them access to everything in real time, because I want to be sure it's worth their time to look at. And now I want to look at this slightly more complicated version here. So we can do some really cool things, and this is taking some concepts that are actually pretty big in auto manufacturing and that I think apply really well to visual effects and to virtual production, and that's the idea of component-based development, or CBD, which most of us think means something else now, but component-based development, CBD. Essentially the concept is, imagine you're making a car. You've got the wheel wells, you've got different pieces in the engine, you've got the exhaust system, the airbags, all of these different things. And you've got different teams that work on these, and they have to get approved, and there's agencies that regulate them. And then you're building a new car, and you say, cool, we're going to take these wheel wells, and we're going to combine it with this new body we made, but we're going to put this engine in it and this exhaust system. You're kind of pulling these from different parts of your company and combining those into the car that you're making. So if you think about it, in visual effects and virtual production especially, we're doing a very similar thing, where on the left side, we have that same structure, or a similar structure, I'll talk about that in a second, to before, where we have our development branch, we've got our vendors, but then we also have some core tools, that these are tools we've developed in-house, tools for our artists, maybe particular procedural tools or tracking tools or pipeline publishing tools that we have. And those might be developed by a separate team. Meanwhile, maybe we have a library of shared files that we all use, that we're able to use on different projects, or maybe a library of just files for this project. Like we're working on a new Marvel movie, and it's like, well, now we have all the models for Captain America's shield and whatever it is. And then we've also got all of our information about our stage itself, about this LED volume. In Unreal, we have those blueprints about how large is this stage, what's its pixel pitch, how is that set up. And maybe we have multiple stages. So we've got all these different components, and we can start combining them so that we can have different people working on different things and not having to duplicate work and worry about replicating our changes across things, because we can just bring it straight in from one stream to another. So first, I want to show you over here, these ones I've highlighted. We have a castle environment and then this junkyard environment. And you might think, wait, Jase, I thought you said we don't do separate streams for things where people might want to share things. This is a particular type of stream called a virtual stream. And basically, that's just like a filter or a mask for its parent stream. So if you're working in junkyard, you're actually working in dev. You're just only seeing a certain section of those files. And the same with Castle. So it just kind of simplifies things for the artists, so they're not looking at a whole lot of files that they're not actually working on. But if there are any shared files between them, we're actually still working in the same stream, so we're going to get those right away. Now we also have our library. And in our library, we've got all kinds of assets. So say we've got a whole folder of beat up cars and dirt, grime textures, things like that. We can import those into our junkyard environment so that anytime someone's working in them here, they get all of those library assets, and if they make changes to them, they change in the library. Same thing with the castle. And then we've got our core tools. We're importing those in. And not only that, But by using component-based development, we can say this project is also using one particular version of those core tools. Because maybe we have a new pipeline we're trying out on a new show, but we don't want to change that on a previous one. You can just tell it, hey, you know what, dev is going to use a previous version of this, and it's always going to use that version. It's not going to update until we tell it to. Meanwhile, another project could also be looking at core tools and actually getting the latest, greatest, most up-to-date stuff. And then the last one over here is that from our stages blueprints, we bring that over into main, so that our artists aren't having to worry about that when they're working on the assets. Our VAD team doesn't have to worry about it. But the people who are actually putting this together to go on the stage, they get to bring in those blueprints for our particular stage. Now, you could just put that in the project itself, but one of the really neat things about using a component-based approach like this is that, let's say we're filming on this stage right here, and we have a scene where we realize, you know what, we're going to do a wire rig for some stunts, or we're going to have 50 actors in this scene. This isn't big enough. We need to upgrade to a larger stage. We could just have another stage blueprint for them, swap out which component we're using, and then without having to change any of our project files, we can open up that stream now and see our project with that new stage in it, in the same place with the same file names, again, like we were doing with our car Steve before. So I hope this has given you some things to think about. I'm really passionate about finding new ways to use the tools that we have to improve the way that we make art, improve the ways that we help other people to make art. And this is something that I really love doing. I want to say thank you all for having me. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask me afterward, or you can send me an email to jlingren@perforce.com. Be careful, there's kind of a number of consonants in the middle there. Be sure you get all of those. But I would love to answer your questions and to help you out with any of this.
All right, do we have any questions out there in the audience? All righty, Vincent, I think it says.
Hi, we've used Perforce as like an Unreal film project beforehand, and I had really difficulties to train like my team to switch from a classical versioning system to using version control. Do you have any hints on how to train your artists to actually use the tools how they are supposed to be?
Yeah, absolutely. That is part of the challenge. If you're bringing in people who come from a traditional VFX background, they're just not used to it, because it is, like I said, it melted my brain a little bit trying to wrap my head around it. What I would recommend is, one thing is making it simpler. So like that original stream diagram I showed where there's just main and just development. And then also using streams. We also have something called Classic Depots, which doesn't have streams, but it makes it so each of the users has to do a little more work to set up their workstation. But streams kind of automate some of that for them, so they can just say, I want to work in this stream, there it is. I think the one big thing, though, to really get through to people is that there's files that they're working on their computer, and they can make changes to those, but they don't exist on the server until they submit them, right? Until they say, yes, I want to add these and I want to send them. And that's different, because if people think about it like Dropbox or Google Drive, it's just every time I save my file, everyone's getting that right away. And if you think about it, in film and VFX, like, we don't want that. I don't want someone to see, especially for me, I'm hitting Control-S every 2 seconds or something while I'm working. I don't want everyone seeing every single version of that, because a lot of them are broken. A lot of them aren't ready yet. So it's kind of getting them in that mindset of, if you make the analogy to more of a publishing system, like you would do with F-Track or ShotGrid, that might help a little bit to kind of say, no one else is going to get this until you publish it up there. And then also to remind them that basically that they can't do any damage, which is kind of a cool thing. That unlike a shared file system where if I delete this whole folder of stuff, now it's deleted and it's gone, and I hope I have some backups.
And we definitely have run into the situation where people thought they deleted everything.
Yes.
My favorite story is that I've been on 2 separate calls with completely different people where they started crying, literally, because they thought they deleted everything.
Yep.
And we had a wonderful guy that was watching over every action on Perforce, Scott on our team. And he'd be all over it. He'd be like, oh, wait, hello, you made some...
Right. Right, so kind of reminding people of that, of like you can cause a headache for your lead, but you can't ruin things, right? Even if you deleted everything and then published that delete of everything, the history's all still there. Nothing's permanent. So at least maybe to take some of their anxiety away, that could help.
So I actually have one question.
Yeah.
You know, you talked about a library of assets there, and you talked about archiving, and these are things that are really important to the studios, as I see that we're going to have, everyone is going to be building a digital backlot, or all of these assets across multiple environments, worlds, aspects. So does that mean you're going to be involved in MAM-DAM stuff, or you're going to help us sort this problem out a little bit?
Yes, great question. So a little bit, yeah. So we actually just released a new product called Helix DAM, which is Helix Digital Asset Management, which is essentially an add-on that goes on top of your Helix core server, where you're doing all this versioning that we talked about. And it gives you things like a web interface so that producers have an easier way to look through things, along with thumbnails and previews, and auto-generated AI tagging through services through AWS or Azure, and an indexed Elasticsearch so that you can search through all of these assets much more quickly, give notes on them, track their status, things like that. So you're kind of adding a lot of those features on top of your versioning that you already have in Helix Core. And a colleague of mine, Katie Cole, actually did a presentation as part of Siggraph that's part of the virtual Siggraph. So if you go onto the site, you can check that out, where she gives a whole talk just about how DAM works and what it can offer to gaming studios and VFX studios.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, it's been wonderful having you. This is so critical to understand if you are going to have more than yourself working on a project, pretty much.
Honestly, I use it even for projects I'm just doing by myself, because I want that safety of knowing that I'm never going to ruin something irreparably, because I've done that before, and it's a painful thing. So yeah, I always have this set up for myself, and it makes it easier for me to archive a project later on. If it's like, well, you know what, I'm going to come back to this later, I don't want to keep paying for storage costs, cool, let me archive that, move it to another drive. I can always bring it back up later if I want to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric.